Corporation, and I'm also a founding member of the monitoring evaluation group within Bond. So I think my question is on the advocacy for M&E overall and also on evaluation. And the majority of medium and small relief organizations, in my opinion, they are far from probably using this guide. So how we enable them to use this guide, and do we need more stepping stones, or I don't know, easy steps where they can reach us, because we just have this discussion, and I think there are some key practical issues within a small and medium organization, and especially when we are talking about localization, this is more relevant. So one is the budget. Second is the capacity of the staff, especially at the country level. Third is obviously the timing and availability of the timing and access. And fourth, and most important, evaluation is not actually the core project cycle, unfortunately, at the moment. It is considered as something outside the core business of relief organization, which starts from fundraising and at the donor report submission. So how we address together some of those issues, and how large charities like us and yourself can help small partners to enable that process. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. That's a really challenging question there. We'll come back to it, sir, please.
Thanks. My name's Thomas. I'm now doing independent consulting. I just left working with Oxfam for the last few years. My experience with Oxfam was actually, I really turned up this notion of evaluation upside down. And for me, it's actually primarily about how to do good project cycle management. It should be integrated into that. And I was always emphasizing to the country offices, forget about what you've got to report to the donor. I compile that report, I'll worry about that. You focus on doing good project cycle management with the data that you're collecting, and you tell me what it is that you want to collect to continue adapting and changing your program over time. And I heard some mention of these types of things like audio-visual and feedback processes and this type of stuff, but I also heard a lot of conversation about how to report upwards and this type of stuff. So I'd like to hear your reflections on that type of distinction.
Thank you very much. Adam, please, in there. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Anne Lloyd.
Oh, I didn't recognise you. Hello.
My question is, you talked a bit about participation, accountability. I wonder if we've got any examples of the community, the affected community, getting feedback after an evaluation. How we go, you use the word tokenistic, and I feel that's often the case. We kind of ask lots of questions and we call that engaging with the community. But then we as evaluators go, and then how do they get feedback after the evaluation on what's happened, what we found, and what's going to happen afterwards? That's my question.
Annie, thank you for that question. One more? We take one more? Please.
Hi, Lydia Richardson from IP Triple Line. I wanted to ask about the new trend in adaptive programming and evaluation, and particularly in conflict-affected states where nothing is cyclical and it's not a clear annual cycle that you're dealing with in terms of feeding into recommended processes and practices on an annual basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Keep the microphone just 1 second. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Just tell us what tell me what IP Triple Line is, if you don't mind, because I don't know.
Triple Line Consulting is an agency that works with international donors for the last 15 or so years, and IP Global is an Indian company that we became one organisation 2 years ago.
Thank you.
We do a lot of evaluations.
Okay, thank you very much. Annie's question about participation and accountability. Margie.
Yeah,
you want to answer that?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And again, our track record is not good on that. What I do have a bit of an issue with is the idea that evaluation is the way to be accountable to affected people. I think it's a tiny, tiny part of that. But at the same time, we generally in the sector have not been good about feeding back. We've also often not been that good about disseminating even back to local staff within organisations. There's been this tendency for all the dissemination events to happen at the kind of headquarters level. I like to think that's changing, but there's a lot of room for improvement. But there are examples, and actually we do have at least a couple, I think, in the guide, because we've tried to put in some good practice examples. And there's one in particular that I can think of, which was a much more participatory approach to evaluation. It was actually under what used to be the old ECB project, bringing together a number of NGOs, where members of the community came together with agency staff when the fieldwork part had finished to discuss the findings and the conclusions, and they were also part of the process of coming up with the recommendations. So that was quite unusual, the intensity of the participation, but there are examples out there, and we just need to make sure we keep learning from them. But at a minimum, feeding back to some of the people who've been consulted, if we're serious about being more accountable to affected people, we've got to take that on board.
Do you like to add to that, or what about the question on? I mean, this is interesting that the two people over here feel that evaluation is not embedded in the project life cycle. How would you respond to their questions?
But I think the point that you try to raise, that could you build kind of the monitoring and evaluation system at the field level more to kind of focus on these key questions around, do we make a difference, and these things, and have it more purposeful, so to speak, or more strategic in the sense that it can feed into evaluations. If that's how I understood your point. Yeah.
It's just making sure that that people understand why the information is being collected, that it's as much for their own purposes on the ground, as well as also to feed up. But for me, essentially, it's to I mean, look, if it's ex post, you're doing an independent evaluation. It's just to wrap up. Yeah. But during the 3, 4, 5 year project, so I work on long-term livelihoods mostly. But it's it's about like adapting your project if you're not doing the right activities, and so people understand why they're collecting the information. Yeah.
Can you just pass a microphone back to Mansour, because he's...
Actually, my point is the ignorance is at all levels. Yeah. And actually, at one point, we also proposed within Bond that why not we formed a board of trustees groups which support evaluations and monitoring and evaluation and learning from that, because trustees is the highest authority in relief organizations. So I would say it's not really about beneficiaries, it's about ignorance at all the level of the project cycle and the organization and the context in which we work.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Maggie, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I was perhaps going to go in a slightly different direction, but I think relating to hopefully what you're both saying, which is it's kind of realising that evaluation is one of a number of different ways of encouraging reflection and learning, and there are many other learning processes, and I think building those learning processes into how we work is really key. So we've again in the guide we give some examples of how you might use learning processes as part of an evaluation. So after action reviews, much more participatory kind of ways of engaging staff in learning, and those can be done as standalone exercises. I think that's also important, that we don't, it's a little bit like what Mikkel was saying about our expectations of evaluation in terms of use. It's also our expectations of evaluation. We shouldn't be waiting for the evaluation moment to do all the learning. It's how can we make sure that that's happening on an ongoing basis, and how can we build in some of those learning processes, which again for small organisations is maybe much more appropriate, and then have a kind of lighter evaluation exercise at the end. But we did one final thing, because when we did the pilot, one of the feedback points was it wasn't sufficiently accessible to smaller organisations. So we've tried to put in some more good practice examples and more ways of doing things lighter, if you like, for organisations that don't have the resources, that the bigger ones do.
Mikhail.
Yeah, I just want one point to this thing about monitoring versus evaluation, and I think again what you were saying about building the evaluation capacity at the field level. I think one of the things, the challenges that I see in our organization is that evaluability of our programs is somehow challenged because we have so many different ways to report to the different donors as well. So it's really difficult to get a coherent kind of M&E system set up. So I think that at least from our side, that's what we try to work with in this thing about being a bit more egoistic on what data do we want to collect and what is the usefulness of this data, and try to look beyond the reporting needs. But the reporting needs will always be there. But it's interesting right now because we are trying to move towards having program or country level evaluations, and there the key evaluability challenge is exactly this: the different reporting demands and requirements.
John, anything to add?
Yes, I'm going to say that in some ways the whole sort of this whole guide grew in a way out of the training that Margie and I were doing on evaluating humanitarian action. And one of the reasons why we were keen on producing a guide was because we recognized that not everyone could afford to come to our training. So we wanted to have a way that would make the training more accessible to, or what we'd learned, more accessible to a large number of people. And that is, of course, the whole reason behind the guide, to make, how to conduct a quality humanitarian evaluation accessible to everybody. So that was one thing. In terms of capacity, yes, there are capacity challenges, but again, that changes with time. And I'm going to say that in terms of Lydia's question about adaptive programming and evaluation, I mean, a good monitoring system should be generating a lot of learning for an aware project manager. A good project manager shouldn't have any surprises in an evaluation. They should already have learned from the regular monitoring about what's going on. So I think that stronger monitoring systems, and also monitoring systems that don't just ask questions about how many sheep did we distribute this week, but I mean, questions that are going to broader, what are people doing with the sheep, those sort of monitoring questions can generate a lot of learning for the interested manager.
John, thank you. I'd really like to try and address Lydia's rather forward-thinking question about adaptive programming. Do we all know what adaptive programming is, or I'm going to break with protocol here just for a second, because I think we have a specialist on adaptive programming in the house. I wonder if Alice can give us can you explain to us all what adaptive... yeah, do you mind being put on the spot?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'll do the best I can, and Lydia can correct me if I'm wrong. I think our perspective on this from LNAP comes from our work on innovation. So there's a bit of overlap between the innovation world and adaptive programming. Essentially, as I understand it, it refers to approaches to programming or management that are meant to be iterative. So they learn as they go, and they importantly make changes as they go in order to hit a broadly defined range of targets that are not well specified. And so to add on to John's point, it's monitoring, but it's also taking the evaluative lens at every step of the way as you go. Yeah.
Perfectly put. And of course, we know, from the State of the System report that the characteristics of crisis are changing. They're getting longer, they're getting deeper, the caseload's getting bigger, but they are going on for longer. And so the kind of nature of humanitarian crisis is changing. And so you do need this adaptive approach. And I know that there are some projects, some case studies out there now looking at what this actually means in practice. But there are big implications for the evaluation community. And, we do have to, as evaluators, I think, adapt the toolbox to be able to evaluate throughout the course of these very long programs now. So on that basis, have you any suggestions or views on how evaluations can actually get to grips with this newer concept of adaptive programming?
Can I just...
Please, Margie.
Yeah, I think I've got two things to say. I mean, one is that, and maybe it's obvious, but maybe it's worth saying, is that when we're doing our evaluations in those kinds of environments, that's one of the things we should be looking for, is how adaptive programming is, and that's requires a slightly different way of thinking, because it's actually trying to track how the crisis has changed, how responsive, how adaptive the organisation and its programmes have been. So that's one thing to say. I have only once in my life been appointed as an evaluator right at the beginning of a programme. It was actually peace building rather than humanitarian. And but it was, of course, the emphasis there was much more on learning rather than on accountability. But it was, I like to think, quite useful for the people who were involved in the programming, who had less space to sort of step back and take stock, that a team of evaluators was able to help create that space, because we were dependent on the staff to hear what was working. But I think that was one way that we were able to actually help create that space. But it's only one time that I've ever had the opportunity to do that. But it was, as an evaluator, it was great. But I think for the programme also, I think it was actually quite helpful.
And how long did that go on for? What was the time frame for that?
It was about a couple of years, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
John, any view on that?
Well, I would say that in some ways adaptive programming is a new name for something that we used to do already. I mean, any good humanitarian project should be, of course, adaptive immediately to the changes in circumstances, and they are. But of course, adaptive programming refers to the much larger programs that are happening, and it's a recognition that if you try and take a traditional development approach where you have a log frame and set objectives, and that doesn't work in a context like Afghanistan, where the situation is constantly changing. But I mean, one of the big problems with adaptive programming and with learning evaluations and learning in general is that you can have an learning evaluation, but if you don't have a learning organization, your learning evaluation isn't going to go very far or do very much. So this is the whole problem. It's a question of whether the organization can actually take lessons on board and use them to change the program, whether that freedom is there or not. And that's really the crux of the matter often.
So it's old wine in new bottles.
In some ways, it's old wine in much bigger, in casks rather than in bottles. I mean, we used to have this in bottles.
Okay.
Now adaptive programming is trying to put it in the whole cask adaptively.
Okay. Now listen, you and I were speaking about the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda, and John Borton, who was a team leader in that evaluation, is just going to correct us, John. So actually correct me, I think, about the utilisation of the report. He says there were a total of 64 recommendations in the synthesis report. And 13 months after the launch of the report, the Joint Evaluation Follow-up and Monitoring and Facilitation Network, called JEF, judged that 24 of the recommendations, which is 38% of the total, had been formally discussed and resolution reached and action taken. Well, thank you very much for that clarification, John. It's very helpful. Now, there's some interesting questions coming in. We haven't got long, but I just want to touch on a couple because they do look interesting. This one is from Michelle Mercier from an organisation called Human Touch, based in Switzerland. And she says, in tense political environments, evaluators are bound to be used by different stakeholders. Do you have a recipe to resist pressures or excessive influences and keep your independence in the delivery of conclusions?
I could try and jump in on that one. I think as an evaluator, you're actually very dependent on your evaluation manager in an organisation to help resist some of that kind of pressure. And so, and we're going back to the Rwanda evaluation, but it was a very seminal evaluation, even though it was many years ago. And it was actually very well documented, the process of doing that evaluation. There was an entire edition of disasters that was allocated to that. And I would really recommend that people go back and read that, because it was such a high-profile evaluation, and John Borton would be able to tell us the kind of political pressure that the evaluators came under, and having a strong evaluation management team as a buffer, if you like, between the program people and the evaluation team, I think was absolutely essential, and that has been well documented. So that is really key. I think that, we're sort of saying that we want to avoid long evaluation reports, but on the other hand, if people don't like your findings, the first thing they will nearly always attack is your methodology. So making sure your methodology is robust and then is very thoroughly described, including where you know there's constraints or where you know that you can't generalize. I think the more honest we can be and the more thorough we can be in writing that up, then the more that you can kind of hold those sorts of pressures at bay. And ultimately, it's down to the integrity of the evaluators. The extent to which you're prepared to put your head on the line, and sometimes you have to put your head on the line.
I would say one of the key tips here is to front load as much of the final discussion as possible, so that you get agreement on what the procedures and processes will be for finalising the report in advance when it's less contentious. And I'm going to say that one of the things we did with the tech evaluation was we agreed at the start what the dispute resolution mechanism would be if there was any dispute about the report contents. And I have to say that I think that partly because we'd already agreed that, there were no disputes about the report contents. So that, I think, helps. Also, one of the things we did there was we circulated all the comments so that everybody could see what other people were saying about the same paragraph. So that also helped to control.
Please, Mikhail.
No, and just maybe one comment on this from my side is, of course, it's maybe a little bit of a mixed blessing, because if you have a lot of attention, you also more easily will have a lot of use of the findings. So, for me, from my side as a manager, I think the more attention and maybe the more also sometimes disagreement you can get. It's not necessarily bad. That can actually bring out the findings and ensure use in interesting ways, I guess.
I'm going to do one more question from the online community here, and this is about language. I think this is a good question, and it's from Shahzad Mithani, former Save the Children, and the question is, one of the biggest changes, I think it must be challenges, one of the biggest challenges for me has been evaluating in a second language. I find it a serious limitation despite having translators. Can one of the panel members please respond to this? Now, you must have all been there at some point. How big a problem is this, and how can you overcome it?
Well, it's a big problem, but normally it depends on the evaluation. Most of the evaluations I've done for key informants, the language is not an issue. I mean, most of the key informants speak English in the evaluations I've done, and I avoid doing evaluations in francophone countries because while my French is good enough to order a meal in a restaurant or a cafe, it's not good enough to do an evaluation, so I don't do those. The thing with translation, you have to be normally good interpreters are expensive, and typically you end up with the driver or someone doing the interpreting if you haven't planned it in your budget and made it clear. And I mean, I've been in places where, I've got fluent Portuguese, so I've been able to hear sort of people translating for visiting delegations and completely laughing over how what has been asked and said in response is completely mistranslated. So it's Maggie?
Please do.
Yeah. Actually, what I found myself increasingly doing when there's been some serious consultation with affected people is actually playing much less of a role myself and working with senior evaluators, researchers from the country or the culture concerned, and so working with them to design the methodology, but actually relying much more on them because they are working in their first language they're able to hear and able to interpret what they're hearing in a way that, as an outsider, I can't do. So, I mean, that's where that's been possible. I find myself increasingly doing that, and then spending a lot more time. So the role I would play is much more in the analysis process. So going through quite a long process of oral analysis with the people who've done the field work, and I found that that's been that's been one way around this.
Good. We have time for a couple of final questions, and so if anybody has any burning questions they'd like to put to the panel, please raise your hand. Adam, please.
Yeah, my question goes back to
Can you say who you are?
Yeah, sorry. I'm Laura Hayward from ICF Consulting, various evaluations for ECHO and DFID. I had a question about, I think it's something that seems to be cropping up with our evaluation commissioners as well. They want to hear early findings, and that's certainly a way of kind of making better use of evaluations. But as an evaluator, it can be quite risky for us as well to be already presenting early findings. So I wondered if anybody had any comments on that and how to get around those risks.
Thank you. That's a good question. And Alice, I think we'll take the final question from you.
Okay, all right.
As a present for being put on the spot earlier.
Thank you. I just had a question about, I know it's kind of come up a little bit already, but around evaluations as they sit within this broader evidence-driven agenda, or the evidence agenda, if you will. So there's been a big push in the sector to improve quality of evidence that's used for decision-making. I'm wondering where evaluations sit in all of that. Has that helped highlight and emphasize the need to use evaluations as a core piece of evidence, or do you feel that evaluations are being slightly crowded out by RCTs and these kinds of new sexy approaches to evidence in the sector? Not that evaluations are not sexy.
No.
Attracted 500 people.
RCTs are though, are they? Oh, well, there you go. Panel.
I could jump in on the early findings, pressure to present early findings. I think it's how you manage expectations around the early findings, because it can be very useful to present early findings to both to engage your users, but also to get some feedback of, if you get huge resistance, that tells you if it's just resistance or maybe that you're way off track. But I think if it's just about how you frame it and manage expectations. So I would always avoid making recommendations until, the kind of end of the process. But actually testing findings, I think, can be very useful. But I think it just depends how you frame it. Testing early findings and making sure that you put the caveats in. We haven't yet been to this part of the country, or we haven't yet spoken to this group of people. The evidence agenda. John, why don't you talk about RCTs?
Before I do that, I'm going to say that one of the best ways to ensure your evaluation is not used is to present the results as a surprise to the commissioning agency at the debriefing. So if you surprise people like that, so what you want is early findings are in fact a very useful way of letting people know there's an issue here, there's an issue there. So by the time you come to what you have to say is no longer so shocking, and people have already formulated potential responses to it. In terms of the whole evidence agenda, I'm completely jaundiced because I don't see any evidence, and neither does the research see any evidence, that policy is to a large extent based on evidence. Policy is based on political decisions. And the role of evidence from the politician's point of view is, a staff, you decided you'll do this, so you quickly search and you find, that one study out of 463 supports my position, therefore that is the study that I will trumpet and talk about when we're presenting the policy. So I'm a bit jaundiced about to what extent evidence is actually influencing policy.
You're getting old, John. Okay, no comment.
But maybe just to come back to because I think evaluators in this sector have come under pressure to use much more quantitative methods, and as I was saying, in many of the contexts in which we're working as evaluators, it's simply not possible to use those kind of methods. And I think we need to be really robust in pushing back against that pressure, and also showing there is rigor in other methods that we're using and they're often very insightful. So I think we need to we need to be, what's the word, assertive, I think is the word, in what's appropriate and when.
Mikhail?
Yeah, I think from my side, I think I see it, as a positive development, also in the sense that it maybe puts on the focus on, do we actually use our evaluations enough, and how do we use them? So this thing about, being able or being more attentive to linking the evaluations to actually decision making, I think is something that can come with this focus on evidence as well. And then just on that, what we've also been discussing here, also maybe to better understand that, your evaluation is not the, all of the evidence, but it can be one piece in what you need to take a decision on. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of things that are good in that regard.
Good. I think we're just about getting to the close of the event. Any final pearls of wisdom from the panelists? Anything particular you want to say as a parting comment, parting shot?
Oh, certainly. Remember, for questions, more is less. Less is more. Fewer questions, more learning.
Any you beat that.
Beat that, exactly. I think it's let's not forget why we're doing evaluations. They take valuable resources. I actually, maybe I would follow the less is more, because I sometimes think if we did less evaluations but more strategically selected evaluations, we'd probably have a lot more impact, and then perhaps we'd have a better chance of seriously consulting affected people.
Thank you very much. Mikhail, you've travelled all the way from Copenhagen. You can have the last word.
I would just say then use the guide. It's a fabulous document.
Okay. Well, look, I'd really like to thank Mikhail, John and Margie. We did ask the experts. They've been a fabulous panel, so please give them a round of applause. And just to thank the online audience as well, and thank you very much for coming. It's been, I hope you've enjoyed it. I found it really fascinating, and please do join us for refreshments right now. Thank you very much.